Okay, so we left off talking about Wundt, and he was the founder of psychology. Most textbooks give him credit for founding psychology because he started to use experimental methods to study mental processes. Now you'll notice it doesn't say behavior and mental processes. Wundt studied mental processes. So he was enmeshed in trying to figure out the best way to measure what goes on inside people's heads that have to be observed or inferred from their behavior. So he was really interested in consciousness, conscious awareness. He was famous for some pretty funny experiments, like putting the subject into a darkened room and then sort of surprising them by jabbing them with a pin. And then the participants' job was to explain what they were experiencing as a function of having been jabbed with a pin. This is kind of a difficult way to measure mental processes because it really relies on the participant being able to describe their mental processes really well. So you've been jabbed with a pin in the dark, and now it's your job to say everything that you're experiencing. So, you're mad probably, you're in pain, you're surprised. I can't imagine all the things that they might have said and all the things that they might have left out. That was one of the problems with Wundt's technique is that, people are not that great at explaining their own mental process. Whenever there's a tragedy, you see the reporter ask somebody at the scene, what did you see or how did you feel about it? And they always say, there's, no way to explain it. Words can't express what I'm feeling because people aren't very good at it. It's hard to explain what you're experiencing. So Wundt's technique got criticized pretty heavily. And it was one of the first things that was fixed when other people started taking over the scientific study of psychology. Now, Edward Titchener was one of Wundt's students. He founded the school of thought called Structuralism. His goal, instead of trying to figure out how to measure mental processes, he got really interested in trying to break down conscious experience into its elemental parts, or the structures that support your conscious awareness. So he got really interested in perception, sensation. How did you collect information from the environment and then make sense of it? So he was really interested in which structures of your experience caused you to have a conscious awareness of what was going on. So he might still use the jabbing you with the pin experiment, but instead of wanting you to explain in detail your experience of it, he might want to know which structures within the experience were important for most people. So most people might have, maybe the one consistent word that kept coming up is surprised. And so he would start to conclude that surprise was an elemental structure or an elemental part of the scenario of being stabbed by a pin in the dark. So he was really interested in these elements and breaking it down into little tiny pieces. So his school of thought was called Structuralism. Okay, now this was all going on over in Germany. Here in the U.S., we were very much influenced by Darwin and his ideas about evolution and adaptation and stuff like that. So even though a lot of psychologists from the U.S. went over to study with Wundt and with Titchener to learn their techniques. In fact, when I was in graduate school, one of the exercises that we engaged in was to follow our psychology pedigree by whoever our mentor was in grad school, who was his mentor, and so on back. And my mentor's pedigree follows back to Titchener. So I'm of the Titchener school of thought, is the idea. The thing is, here in the U.S., even though a lot of American psychologists were trained by Wundt and or Titchener, we were really interested in this adaptation component here in the U.S. So a new school of thought came along called Functionalism. And in Functionalism, we're really interested in, so we've got these behaviors. We can talk, we can see, we can remember things. We have, all these skills and behaviors. how do they help us to adapt to our environment? Why have they been preserved, or why have they developed over the history of mankind so that today we have these skills? Functionalists were really interested in the function of these behaviors. So what are the functions of behavior and mental experiences rather than what are the structures, right? A natural offshoot of functionalism was, and how can we apply this to life? How can we help people to use their memory more effectively? How can we help people to use language more effectively? Things like that. William James is credited with really bringing psychology to the United States. He established the first psychology laboratory in the U.S. after having gone to Germany and studying with Titchener and Wundt. And like I said, we also have to give Charles Darwin, who's obviously not a psychologist, but he is a biologist, we have to give him a little bit of credit for having so strongly influenced the way that psychology went in the U.S. His influence in making people think about the role of adaptation. And psychologists thought maybe it's not always, morphological adaptation like Darwin talked about, he studied finches and how their beaks changed as a function of the food that was available in the niche that they occupied. Instead of talking about that, psychologists were interested in how does a behavior help us to adapt and function and survive as a species. Okay. Now I have to throw Sigmund Freud in at some point. Even though he's not really a psychologist, he's the most frequently named psychologist. That's who everybody thinks of. So I have to throw him in here. He kind of overlaps a number of these schools of thought. Structuralism, Wundt and Titchener came first. And they kind of dominated till about 1890. Then functionalism came along, and they dominated until about 1920, especially here in the U.S. Freud came along in 1889 and wrote a book called The Interpretation of Dreams. And that really got him on the forefront of people's minds. Because, people love to try and figure out what their dreams mean, right? So he really hit a topic that people love. So 1889 is when he came on scene, and he died in 1939. He was still a very active lecturer and stuff by that time. Even though he was very sick, he still was publishing and stuff by 1939. So you could say 1889 to 1939, Freud was really on top of things. And then he had a really big influence that continues to you can see those effects today. So what did he introduce that's so important? Well, he founded the school of thought called psychoanalytic theory. And he introduced the concept of unconscious mental processes. So you've got, we've already addressed that mental processes are things that go on inside your head. He thinks so that we can't directly observe them, right? So as psychologists, we want to look at behaviors that are evidence of those mental processes. He goes one step further, and he says, not only do you have things going on inside your head that I can't see, you have things going on inside your head that you can't see. They are unconscious, and you're unaware of them. Those unconscious mental processes, without you knowing it, they impact the way that you're feeling about things, or the thoughts that you're having, or the behaviors that you're engaging in. So he introduced this concept of the unconscious. The key thing about the unconscious is that it operates outside of conscious awareness. So it can do things sort of like behind your back. You don't even realize that it's having these impacts. When you have unconscious conflicts going on, there are more, we'll talk about this more in the chapter on personality, but there's more than one component of your personality that he thought was unconscious. And those two components can argue with each other and battle over what behaviors they want you to engage in, or how they want you to act in a certain situation. And so these conflicts can influence your behavior and your personality. So, like I said, Freud sort of overlays everything. Otherwise, we're going in a nice linear progression from structuralism to functionalism, and then behaviorism came on the scene. And behaviorism is different from functionalism because behaviorism refuses to study anything that cannot be directly observed. So we can't talk about memory in behaviorism like we could in functionalism. We can't talk about thoughts that you're having inside your head like we could in functionalism or in structuralism. So in behaviorism, we can only study observable behavior. So we've got a few people who we'll talk about in the chapter on learning, like Pavlov. He was Russian and he studied classical conditioning in animals. This is a very rudimentary type of learning that happens without your conscious awareness, without you intending to learn associations. You'll learn associations, and that's classical conditioning. Watson, who we really won't talk about anymore after this chapter, he really took Pavlov's findings with animals, because Pavlov was famous for working with dogs. You may have heard about that. And Watson applied those findings and those techniques to humans. And what's interesting about Watson is that he got in trouble because of a scandal with one of his graduate students, blah, blah, got fired. And so he got a job in the 1930s working as an advertising executive. So you take your knowledge that he's, studying classical conditioning on humans, and then he was applying it to marketing, and you kind of get the impression that maybe he was trying to shape human behavior using some techniques that he had learned, as a psychologist. Our final guy that we'll talk about, and we'll talk about this guy for sure in chapter 7, learning, is B.F. Skinner. And you may have heard of him. He trained rats and pigeons and, to a certain extent, humans to behave in desirable ways, the ways that Skinner wanted them to, by rewarding those behaviors, and to stop doing certain behaviors by punishing those behaviors. He called this technique operant conditioning, because the learner realizes that the outcome affects their behavior. So I do something, I get a reward that makes me want to do the behavior again. So that outcome is operantly conditioning me to either do the behavior again or not. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break, because we're getting into sort of modern times now, and we'll finish up that in the next segment.